August 7, 1944, Normandy, France. A Sherman tank is burning. The crew inside has 30 seconds to live. The ammunition is cooking off. The hatches are jammed. 5 men are screaming inside a steel coffin that cost the United States government $49,000 to build and 3 weeks to ship across an ocean. It took one German teenager with a disposable rocket launcher that cost less than a pair of boots exactly 4 seconds to destroy it. That teenager is already gone, already crawling back into the hedgerow, already smiling. This has happened 172 times in the past 6 weeks. 172 Shermans, 860 men, gone. Not to superior German armor, not to brilliant tactical genius, but to a shoulder-fired rocket that any frightened 18-year-old could operate after 2 hours of training. The United States Army had crossed an ocean, survived the bloodiest beach landing in history, and was now being systematically butchered by a weapon that cost less than the boots on your feet. The generals had no answer. The engineers had no answer. The entire industrial machine of the most powerful nation on Earth had no answer. But somewhere in a Pacific jungle, 12 months earlier, a soldier with dirty hands and 0 engineering credentials had already solved the problem. He did not file a report. He did not brief a general. He grabbed an empty ammunition can, a field telephone, and a welding torch, and he built something so insane, so embarrassingly simple, that when you hear what it was, your first reaction will be disbelief. That solution would eventually save thousands of American lives. It would turn the most feared ambush weapon in the German arsenal into a guaranteed death sentence for the man who fired it. And it would produce a kill ratio so lopsided at a critical battle in eastern France that German commanders refused to believe the numbers were real. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This is the forensic story of how ordinary men transformed a burning coffin into an ambush-proof killing machine. To understand why those Shermans kept dying, you have to understand the ground they were dying on. The bocage of Normandy is not the rolling green countryside of English postcards. It is a labyrinth. A maze built over 1,000 years by Norman farmers stacking earth and planting roots to divide their fields. The hedgerows stand 4 feet of compacted dirt at the base, topped with 15 feet of ancient tangled vegetation. They are not hedges. They are walls. Solid, impenetrable, centuries-old walls that channel every road, every path, every possible line of advance into a single predictable corridor. Now seal yourself inside a Sherman tank. Button the hatches. Lock everything down. Your visibility comes through narrow glass periscopes that give you a combined field of view so limited that a person standing in the open would consider it laughable. You can see narrow bouncing slices of the world outside. You do not see the landscape. You see fragments of it. And now surround that buttoned-up tank with those walls. You are not moving through open terrain. You are moving through a green tunnel whose ceiling you cannot see and whose walls you cannot look over. And every single turn in that tunnel is a perfect place to die. German Lieutenant General Richard Schimpf, commanding the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division on the St. Lo front, wrote in July 1944 that his paratroopers had overcome their fear of tanks with remarkable speed. Men who had never been trained as tank killers were crawling up to Shermans and putting rockets through them at point-blank range. His soldiers were not elite panzer troops. They were not specially equipped. They were infantry with a disposable weapon that cost almost nothing, hiding behind walls that had been standing since the Middle Ages. The Panzerfaust had an effective range of 40 to 60 meters. In the bocage, 60 meters was an eternity. You would see the American tank long before it could ever see you. You could hear it grinding through the dirt corridor long before it rounded the bend. You knew exactly where it was going because there was only one place it could go: the corridor, the tunnel, the kill zone. American tank losses in the bocage were catastrophic by any mathematical measure. Some armored units lost and replaced their entire complement of vehicles in a single month of fighting. A Sherman could survive a beach landing push 30 miles inland and die to a single shot from a weapon hidden in vegetation that had been growing there since before the United States existed as a country. German anti-tank rockets accounted for a disproportionate 21% of total American crew casualties, because when those weapons connected, the crew rarely got out. But here is what almost no popular history of the Normandy campaign tells you honestly. The weapon was not the real problem. The ground was the real problem. The bocage gave German infantry something they had nowhere else on the entire Western Front. Perfect concealment, perfect range, perfect predictability. They knew where the tank was going before the tank crew did. And the Americans were making it catastrophically worse by ignoring a communication failure so embarrassing that the Army barely acknowledged it existed. In the middle of the hedge country, a Sherman platoon and a company of infantry were supposed to advance together. The infantry walked beside the tanks, watching the hedgerows, watching the tree lines, watching the shadows. They spotted things the sealed tank crew could never see. A helmet glinting through a gap in the vegetation, a rifle barrel pushing through a tangle of roots, a man in a hole 40 meters ahead on the left flank. The infantry soldier knew. He desperately needed to tell the tank commander. He could not. The tank radios operated on completely different frequencies than the handheld sets carried by infantry. There was no common channel, no direct link. To warn the tank, the soldier had to physically run in front of the moving vehicle, exposing himself to every threat he was trying to warn about, and wave his arms until the commander noticed. Or he had to run the message back through the chain of command, which took so long that by the time it arrived, the Sherman was already burning. German commanders had identified this gap with clinical precision. Lieutenant General Freiherr von Luttwitz, commanding the 2nd Panzer Division in Normandy, wrote in a captured battlefield assessment that his infantry were deliberately exploiting the communication isolation of American armored vehicles. Close quarters fighting, he wrote, cancels every American advantage. At point-blank range, their artillery cannot help them. Their air power becomes useless, and their tanks cannot talk to their own infantry, which in the bocage is a guaranteed death sentence. His men had been at war for 5 brutal years. They understood the geometry of their weapons and the geometry of American weakness, and in the dense hedge country, that geometry favored them completely. Every single time. But the answer to that geometry was already being built, and it was being built not on a French battlefield, not in a Pentagon laboratory, not in a high-clearance engineering facility with a classified project number and a general signature. It was being built on an island in the South Pacific that most people have completely forgotten by a soldier whose name the military records never thought important enough to write down. It is November 1943, Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands chain. The jungle here makes the Norman bocage look like a park. Visibility is sometimes measured in feet. Japanese forces have had months to fortify every approach route with concealed bunkers and hidden anti-tank positions buried so deeply into the vegetation that you could walk within 10 feet of them and see nothing. American tank crews are dying for the exact same reason they will die in France a year later. The infantry walking beside them can see the threats. The tank crews cannot, and there is a technological wall between the eyes on the ground and the guns in the turrets. A Marine wants to warn a tank commander about a hidden anti-tank position 30 meters ahead. He runs up to the moving hull. He bangs on the steel with his rifle butt. If the commander opens his hatch to listen, the Japanese snipers waiting in the canopy fire immediately. If the commander stays sealed, he drives directly into the kill zone. There is no good option. Men are dying because of this. Men are dying every single day because of this. And then someone decided enough was enough. Whoa. Military archives do not give this man a name. The records call it a collective field modification. But someone picked up a standard military field telephone from a supply depot. Someone found an empty .30 caliber metal ammunition can. Someone welded that can directly to the rear armor plate of a Sherman tank. Someone routed the telephone wire through an existing gap in the hull and hardwired it directly into the tank's internal intercom system. The external handset was now plugged directly into the headsets of the tank commander and the gunner. Think about how absurdly simple that is. Think about how perfectly obvious it seems the moment you hear it described, and then ask yourself why no other army in the history of armored warfare had done it before. The answer is doctrine. Every major military power had built its armored philosophy around the idea that tanks and infantry operated in separate spheres that communicated through pre-planned signal codes and slow command chain relays. The unspoken assumption was that the tank was the primary weapon and the infantry walked in its shadow. And the telephone on the back deck declared something completely different. It declared that the infantry soldier crouching in the mud, who could actually see what was happening in real time, was the most important sensor the tank possessed. The blind crew inside the steel box desperately needed to hear from him instantly, not in 5 minutes, not through 3 layers of radio relay. Now, in the middle of the firefight, before the rocket fired, Marines tested crude versions at Tarawa in late 1943. By Iwo Jima in early 1945, it was standard equipment. And American armored units in Europe, watching their Sherman crews die in the bocage to threats no one inside the hull ever saw coming, started building the exact same solution in their motor pools at night. Welders worked through the dark hours attaching empty ammunition boxes to the rear decks of hundreds of Shermans. The modification was not authorized by any official technical manual. It was not approved by any general. It was built by desperate men who understood the geometry of their own dying and decided to change it with whatever they had in reach. Now return to the Norman hedgerow. Return to the German Fallschirmjäger squad, waiting in the dense vegetation with their Panzerfäuste. Their entire tactical doctrine was built on one absolute certainty. The approaching American tank was deaf and blind. The infantry escort walking beside it was a separate, disconnected entity that could be ignored or suppressed until the armor was destroyed. That certainty was the foundation of everything. That certainty had worked perfectly for 6 weeks. An American infantryman spots movement 40 meters ahead in the brush. He does not shout. He does not wave. He drops behind the Sherman and lifts the handset from the ammunition can welded to the rear hull. He speaks quietly. The tank commander listening through his headset does not have to interpret frantic arm signals through a narrow periscope. He hears exact words, exact bearing, exact distance. The turret begins to move before the German in the hedgerow even knows he has been seen. The Fallschirmjäger soldier is still waiting for the perfect shot. He is still counting meters. 40, 35. He has done this dozens of times. He knows exactly how this ends. He squeezes the trigger. The rocket fires. The exhaust smoke from the Panzerfaust launch blooms instantly in the vegetation behind him, a massive visible cloud that marks his exact position as clearly as a flare. Bendish. Under the old rules, the tank would stop and burn or reverse in panic while the crew screamed. Under the new rules, the infantryman who saw the launch smoke is already back on the phone. The turret is already moving, fast. Faster than any piece of steel that Heavy has any right to move. The hydraulic traverse motor gives a Sherman's turret a full rotation in 15 seconds. A Tiger needs 60. In combat time, measured in the frantic seconds between firing and dying, that is not a marginal difference. That is the difference between ambush and execution. The German soldier has 3 seconds to understand what has gone wrong. He has perhaps 5 seconds to decide to run. He does not have enough seconds to do either before the gun completes its rotation and the 75mm shell arrives. By late July 1944, German frontline commanders were reporting something that made no tactical sense. Their best anti-tank team's men who had honed the hedgerow ambush to a perfect science over 6 weeks of bloody success were taking catastrophic casualties. Not just failing their ambushes, dying in them. The psychological advantage that had made German paratroopers fearless against American armor in June was eroding into something that looked disturbingly like dread. Every time they pulled the trigger, the turret swung. Every time the turret swung, the clock started. And the clock was running out faster than any of them had been trained to survive. But the telephone and the traversing gun were still only 2 pieces of the system. There was a third mechanism hidden inside the Sherman that no German tank had ever carried. A piece of engineering so advanced that German factories captured intact examples, analyzed them completely, and still could not replicate it. A device that gave American tank crews a capability that German armored doctrine considered impossible. And in the next part of this story, we are going to show exactly what it did to a column of brand new Panther tanks on a foggy September morning in eastern France, when the finest German armor remaining in the West drove blindly into a killing ground that American crews had spent 3 weeks preparing. 86 Panthers destroyed. 25 Shermans lost. A kill ratio so lopsided that when the numbers reached German high command, the officers who read them thought the report was a mistake. It was not a mistake. It was the system working exactly as designed. And in part 2, you will see the third mechanism that made that massacre possible. In part 1, we watched American tank crews dying in the Normandy bocage because their Shermans were blind, isolated, and predictable. We saw how an unnamed soldier in a Pacific jungle welded a field telephone to the back of a tank and collapsed the communication gap forever. We saw how hydraulic power traverse gave the Sherman a turret rotation time of 15 seconds compared to 60 for the Tiger. 2 mechanisms, both improvised, both born from desperation rather than doctrine. But there was a third mechanism, and this one did not come from a jungle. It came from a boardroom fight that nearly ended the entire program before it ever reached France. Here is the number that the United States Army did not want to discuss in the summer of 1944, 70%. That was the hit probability achieved during controlled proving ground tests by a stabilized Sherman firing its main gun at moving targets, while the tank itself was moving at 15 miles per hour. 70%. Moving, firing, hitting. No German tank could do this. Not the Panther, not the Tiger, not the Panzer IV. The Westinghouse Corporation had delivered a gyroscopic gun stabilizer to the Sherman program as standard equipment since 1941, and almost nobody in the United States Army was actually using it. That number, 70%, was about to become the most dangerous secret on the Western Front. And the man standing between that secret and the men dying in France was not a German general. He was an American colonel sitting behind a desk in England. His name does not matter as much as what he believed. He believed that tank gunnery was a craft mastered through stillness. You halted. You aimed. You fired. That was the doctrine. That was what every tanker from Fort Knox to North Africa had been trained to do. The stabilizer, in his view, was a mechanical distraction, a gadget that confused gunners and introduced variables that experienced crews did not need. He had voiced this opinion in writing formally in a training memorandum distributed to armored units across the European theater in May 1944. The memorandum instructed crews to disengage the stabilizer in combat conditions and rely on traditional stationary fire technique. Crews obeyed. The stabilizers sat idle inside the turrets of hundreds of Shermans switched off, while the men operating those tanks died in ambushes that a moving firing tank could have survived. When Captain William Combs of the 2nd Armored Division's Operational Research Section put together the casualty analysis, in July 1944, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Units that had informally reactivated their stabilizers and trained their crews to fire on the move were surviving ambush contacts at a measurably higher rate. The difference was not marginal. It was the difference between a tank that stopped to return fire and became a stationary target, and a tank that kept moving and put accurate rounds downrange while the enemy was still calculating where to aim. Combs brought the analysis to his commanding officer. His commanding officer brought it to the colonel. The colonel looked at the numbers and said something that veterans of that meeting remembered for the rest of their lives. "My tankers do not need to fire while moving. They need to stop exposing themselves to ambush by moving through terrain they haven't reconnoitered." Combs stared at him. "Sir, with respect, the problem is that the terrain forces them into corridors. They cannot reconnoiter what they cannot see over. Then they should dismount and look." The snipers kill them when they dismount. The colonel closed the folder. The meeting was over. Combs had 24 hours before he was reassigned to a logistics posting behind the supply lines. Someone in that headquarters did not want the analysis going any further up the chain. The casualties in the bocage were being categorized under tactical errors and crew inexperience, not equipment misuse. Changing that categorization meant admitting that a training memorandum signed by senior officers had been contributing to the death toll. Nobody in that building wanted to sign their name to that conclusion, but Combs found his unexpected ally in the most unlikely place. Brigadier General Albin Irzik was commanding the 8th Tank Battalion, and he had already arrived at the same conclusion independently. Not from a statistical analysis, from watching his own crews die. He had personally observed the correlation between stabilizer use and survival rate in his own unit, and he had spent 3 weeks quietly ordering his crews to reactivate their stabilizers and practice firing on the move during every road march between engagements. When Combs reached him through a mutual contact in the operations section, Irzik did not need convincing. He needed ammunition. He needed numbers he could put in front of a general senior enough to override the training memorandum. And Combs had those numbers. They had one shot at this. Irzik arranged a demonstration, not a request. A demonstration framed as a routine training exercise scheduled for a forward motor pool outside Coutances on the afternoon of July 28, 1944. The audience would include 2 visiting officers from 12th Army Group Headquarters who were touring frontline units as part of a post-Cobra operational review. If those officers saw what Irzik believed they would see, the memo would be overridden before the end of the week. If they didn't, Combs was going back to the supply depot, and Irzik was going to spend the rest of the campaign fighting with his hands tied. The morning of July 28th was overcast and humid. The motor pool outside Coutances smelled of diesel and churned mud. 2 Sherman crews had been selected both from the 8th Battalion, both having trained with the stabilizer engaged for the previous 3 weeks. The course was a 300-meter stretch of rutted farm track with 6 human silhouette targets positioned at varying ranges between 80 and 400 meters off the right flank. The visiting officers arrived at 1400 hours. One of them looked at the muddy track and the beat-up Shermans and said nothing. The other checked his watch. The first crew ran the course with stabilizers disengaged. Standard doctrine. They halted at 3 designated points fired from stationary positions and engaged all 6 targets. Time from course entry to final shot, 4 minutes 11 seconds. Hits, 4 out of 6. Hit percentage, 67%. From a stopped tank on a calm afternoon with no incoming fire, no enemy movement, and no stress beyond 2 senior officers watching, the second crew ran the course with stabilizers engaged. They did not stop. The Sherman came through the entry point at 12 miles per hour and stayed at 12 miles per hour for the entire 300 meters. The gun moved independently of the hull tracking targets as the tank rolled across the rutted ground, the gyroscope absorbing the pitch and bounce and feeding constant corrections to the hydraulic elevation system. The crew fired 6 times in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. They never touched the brakes. Hits 5 out of 6. Hit percentage 83%. Moving, on a rutted track, in under 3 minutes. The officer who had checked his watch was still holding it in his hand. He was looking at the numbers on his notepad, and then looking at the track, and then looking at the numbers again. The other officer turned to Irzik and said, "Run it again." They ran it 3 more times over the following 90 minutes. The average hit percentage for stabilizer-engaged moving fire across all 4 runs was 79%. The average for stationary fire in the same afternoon was 64%. The moving tank was more accurate than the stopped tank, because the stopped tank was a target, and a stressed crew inside a stationary target did not shoot as well as a crew that was still moving and felt the ground rolling under them. The training memorandum was quietly withdrawn from circulation within 4 days. No announcement, no formal correction. It simply stopped being distributed, and a new training guidance began flowing down through armored unit commanders, emphasizing stabilizer use and moving fire drills. The colonel who had written the original memorandum was reassigned to a training command in England before August ended. In the weeks that followed, motor pool crews across the Third Army began cycling every available Sherman through accelerated stabilizer familiarization training. The sessions ran 2 hours per crew. Gunners who had never engaged the system learned to trust the gyroscope to understand that the movement under their feet was not the enemy of accuracy, but irrelevant to it when the mechanism was working. The instinct to stop before firing was replaced slowly and with repetition by the opposite instinct: keep moving, trust the system, fire while rolling. And German anti-tank teams in the Bocage began reporting something that made no sense within their tactical framework. American tanks that had been hit and should have stopped were continuing to move and continuing to fire while moving. The survival window of the Panzerfaust ambush team relied on the assumption that a hit tank stopped. A stopped tank could be hit again. A stopped tank's crew would be disoriented. Its commander would be ducked inside the hatch, and the ambush team could withdraw before the response came. A tank that kept moving after being hit and was firing back accurately while still rolling gave the ambush team no window at all. German after-action reports from late July and early August 1944 described American tanks as exhibiting abnormal movement discipline under fire. The phrase used in multiple capture documents was that the vehicles appeared to ignore damage in a way that seemed tactically irrational. What they were actually describing was the stabilizer. A crew that trusted the system did not stop to confirm they were still operational. They kept rolling and kept firing, and the gyroscope kept the gun on target through all of it. By September 1944, Patton's Third Army had broken out of Normandy completely, and the war of maneuver had begun. The integrated system telephone plus traverse speed, plus open hatch doctrine, plus gyroscopic stabilizer was now fully deployed across the spearhead divisions. And in eastern France, near a small town called Haraucourt, the German High Command was assembling something they believed would finally break it. Brand new Panther tanks. 2 full brigades. Crews pulled from training depots with less than 6 weeks on their vehicles. The High Command believed that superior armor and superior main gun range would overwhelm whatever the Americans had learned in the Bocage. They believed that in open terrain with long sight lines, the Panther's 2,000-meter effective range would restore the natural order of tank combat. What they did not know was that the American 4th Armored Division had been sitting in that terrain for 3 weeks. The crews knew every ridgeline, every woodline, every approach corridor. And on the morning of September 19th, a dense ground fog settled across the entire battlefield and reduced visibility to less than 100 meters. The German commanders welcomed the fog. It grounded the American fighter bombers that had been tearing apart German armor since Falaise. Without air cover, they believed the Americans would be helpless against Panther frontal armor at any range. They had forgotten about the telephone. They had forgotten about the turret speed. They had forgotten about the stabilizer. And they had never understood the open hatch doctrine at all. In Part 3, we will show you exactly what happened when those Panthers drove blind into a position where every American gun was already aimed and every American crew was already waiting. The numbers from Haraucourt will tell you everything about which system won and which philosophy of tank warfare died in that fog. And we will show you the moment when a German brigade commander watching his columns dissolve in front of him finally understood what his infantry had been trying to describe from the hedgerows of Normandy all summer long. 86 German tanks, 25 American. One morning, the war was not over, but after Haraucourt, one side knew exactly how it was going to end. In Part 1, a nameless soldier in a Pacific jungle welded a field telephone to the back of a Sherman tank and collapsed the communication gap that German infantry had spent years exploiting. In Part 2, Captain Combs and General Ehrsick fought through institutional resistance to restore the gyroscopic stabilizer to combat use, proving in a muddy French motor pool that a moving Sherman was more accurate than a stopped one. 3 mechanisms were now fully operational: the telephone, the traverse speed, the stabilizer, and the open hatch doctrine binding them together. But the Germans were watching. And what they saw happening to their anti-tank teams in the Bocage was producing a response that would escalate everything to a scale nobody had anticipated. By late August 1944, German intelligence had compiled enough survivor testimony to construct an accurate picture of what they were facing. The reports crossing the desk of General der Panzertruppe, Heinrich Eberbach, described a pattern so consistent it could not be dismissed as coincidence or bad luck. American tanks were responding to ambushes in under 15 seconds. American tanks were firing accurately while still moving. American tanks appeared to have advanced knowledge of concealed positions. German anti-tank teams were dying at a rate that was making the Panzerfaust ambush doctrine operationally unsustainable. Eberbach convened an emergency tactical conference on August 22nd. The officers in that room had commanded armor across 5 years of total war on 3 continents. They had never seen casualty figures like the ones being reported from the Bocage ambush teams. In June, a Panzerfaust team could expect to fire, kill, and withdraw successfully approximately 70% of the time. By mid-August, that figure had inverted. 70% of teams that engaged American tank infantry formations were taking casualties before they could withdraw. 31 Fallschirmjäger anti-tank specialists had been killed in a single week in one sector alone. The conference identified 3 possible explanations. First, the Americans had deployed some form of forward detection technology, possibly acoustic or thermal. Second, the infantry-tank communication gap had been closed by a method German intelligence had not yet identified. Third, American tank crews had developed a firing doctrine that eliminated the stationary halt that ambush timing was calculated around. All 3 explanations were correct. The Germans had arrived at the right answer. They simply had no effective response to it. The tactical counter they implemented was brutal in its logic. If the American system depended on infantry staying alive long enough to warn the tank crew, then the infantry had to die first. German mortar teams were redeployed with specific priority targeting on infantry escorts rather than armored vehicles. Machine gun positions were repositioned to sweep the flanks of American advance corridors at a height specifically calculated to catch men walking beside tanks, rather than the tanks themselves. Sniper teams received new standing orders that explicitly deprioritized foot soldiers and focused exclusively on the exposed heads of American tank commanders in open hatches. In certain sectors, this worked. American tank losses spiked in areas where German infantry successfully suppressed the escort companies. Without the telephone caller, the traverse speed meant nothing. Without the open hatch commander, the stabilizer had no directing intelligence behind it. But the Germans were replacing their experienced ambush teams with teenagers pulled from training depots, and the Americans were replacing their tactical dead with veterans who had already learned the system. The institutional knowledge was flowing in one direction only. Then came the technical crisis that nearly unraveled everything. The gyroscopic stabilizer was a precision instrument. It was designed and calibrated in a controlled manufacturing environment and tested on proving ground surfaces that bore no resemblance to the rock-strewn farm tracks and shattered pavements of northern France. When armored units began pushing the system through the accelerated familiarization training that IRSEC had mandated, the failure rate of the stabilizer mechanisms began climbing in a way that the technical manuals had not predicted. And the gyroscope bearings were wearing faster than the replacement supply chain could support. In 1 week in early August, the 2nd Armored Division reported 41 stabilizer failures across its tank complement. Crews who had just built confidence in the system were reverting to stationary fire doctrine because their stabilizers were grinding to a halt mid-engagement. 3 tanks in the 9th Armored Division had their stabilizer hydraulics fail during active contact with the enemy, and in the confusion of switching to manual fire, 2 of those tanks were hit before their crews could adapt. The colonel who had originally circulated the memorandum ordering stabilizers disengaged, quietly resurfaced in the internal discussion. He was no longer in theater, but his written position was being cited by officers who wanted to pause the moving fire program pending a full mechanical review. They had ammunition now. They had failure statistics. They had 3 tanks that had been hit during a stabilizer transition moment, and they were prepared to argue that the system was introducing a new vulnerability in exchange for the accuracy advantage. Combs was back at a desk this time, legitimately working the operational research numbers. He looked at the failure rate data and saw something the critics were not reporting. The failures were concentrated in units that had received the accelerated 2-hour training. The units that had been running the system continuously for 3 or more weeks, Irzik's battalion, and 2 others that had adopted it early, were reporting failure rates below 4%. The mechanism was not fragile. It was being broken by undertrained crews who were fighting the gyroscope instead of trusting it. The solution was more training time, not suspension. Irzik pushed that conclusion up the chain with the numbers behind it. The suspension proposal died in committee. But the debate had cost 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks, the Panthers were rolling toward Ericourt. September 19, 1944. Ericourt, Lorraine, Eastern France, 0530 hours. The fog is absolute. Visibility is under 100 meters in most sectors, 0 in some. Colonel Creighton Abrams has positioned the 37th Tank Battalion on a series of low ridgelines overlooking the approach corridors his crews have been studying for 21 days. The artillery batteries are pre-registered. The infantry squads are forward in the mist with field telephones. Every Sherman commander is standing in his open hatch in the freezing damp because closing it now would be the same as dying blind. The 113th Panzer Brigade is advancing in column. The Panthers are brand new. The crews have less than 6 weeks on their vehicles. Their commanders are sealed inside their turrets, following doctrine staring into white. Nothing through their periscopes, listening to the roar of American engines that echo confusingly through the fog and give no reliable bearing. The first contact happens at 0547. An American infantry scout 30 meters forward of the nearest Sherman ridgeline hears track noise. He counts the interval between clanks. Heavy vehicle. Multiple vehicles. Coming north-northeast. He drops back 8 meters to the Sherman behind him and picks up the telephone. Bearing and distance delivered in 12 words. The Sherman commander verifies by sound. His hydraulic traverse motor engages. The gun moves. The lead Panther emerges from the fog at 90 meters. The American gun is already on it. The shot goes through the Panther's side armor at 90 meters. The side armor of a Panther is 45 millimeters. At 90 meters, a 75 millimeter armor-piercing round treats it as suggestion. The Panther stops. It does not brew immediately, but it is finished, and the crew knows it. 2 men get out. The others do not. The column behind halts. Standard drill. The commanders are trying to locate the muzzle flash. The fog has already swallowed it. The Sherman has moved 40 meters laterally along its ridge and is now in a new position. The 2nd Panther pushes forward trying to find the threat. Another infantry telephone call. Another bearing. The Sherman fires from the new position. The 2nd Panther loses its left track. It spins, exposes its rear, and the Sherman puts a second round through the engine deck. 2 Panthers. 4 minutes. Neither German crew fired a single shot. The rest of the 113th Brigade is now advancing on multiple axes, trying to find something to shoot at. They are driving fast in poor visibility with undertrained crews and no infantry support, and no artillery coordination, and no knowledge of the terrain. They are driving directly into a grid that American crews have memorized down to the last depression and woodline. The Shermans do not fight the Panthers. They fight the corridors. Every approach route has a Sherman waiting at a pre-planned angle with a pre-planned shot. When a Panther appears, it appears where it was expected to appear at the range it was expected to appear, and the gun is already there. The stabilizer keeps the shot true as the Sherman shifts position between engagements. The telephone keeps the infantry as the forward eyes when the fog makes visual acquisition impossible. The 15-second traverse keeps the gun moving from target to target faster than German commanders can process what is happening to their formation. By 900, the 113th Panzer Brigade has lost 11 tanks. By 1400, they have lost 23. By the end of the day, they have lost 31 vehicles, and the brigade has ceased to function as a coherent fighting formation. The 111th Brigade attacking on a parallel axis fares worse. German armor that was supposed to break the American spearhead is itself broken before noon. The 4th Armored Division loses 7 Shermans in the morning engagement, 4 more in the afternoon when German commanders attempt a desperate concentrated thrust that briefly achieves local numerical superiority, before American artillery pre-registered on exactly that approach ends it in 9 minutes. Total American losses at Aracourt over 3 days of fighting, 25 Shermans. Total German losses, 86 tanks destroyed, another 114 damaged, broken down, or abandoned. A kill ratio of 3.6 to 1 against the tank that was supposed to be technically superior in every measurable category. German prisoners taken at Aracourt described the same experience over and over in their interrogation reports. American guns were already aimed before German crews had located the threat. American tanks continued moving and firing after taking hits that should have stopped them. The fog that was supposed to neutralize American air power had somehow made the American ground forces more effective, not less, because their system did not depend on seeing far. It depended on the infantry 30 meters ahead, who could hear and smell and feel what the tank periscopes could not possibly detect. The news from Aracourt traveled through the Third Army in days, and through the broader Allied command in weeks. The kill ratio was not a rounding error. The Operational Research Section confirmed the numbers 3 times. The implications were not subtle. When properly trained American tank infantry teams engaged German armor in close terrain, the outcome was not determined by the technical specifications of the individual vehicles. It was determined by which side had better real-time information and faster mechanical response to that information. The German armored doctrine of the heavy tank at long range in a prepared position was not defeated by a better tank. It was defeated by a system that refused to fight on those terms. German armored casualties in the Lorraine campaign between September and November 1944 exceeded 700 vehicles. American armored losses in the same period were under 200. The ratio held across terrain and weather and unit quality because the mechanisms were now institutional. The telephone was on every tank. The stabilizer was being used. The open hatch commanders were riding exposed because every veteran who had survived the bocage had told every replacement the same thing. The closed hatch kills you slower. American armored divisions that had entered Normandy in June, suffering catastrophic loss rates, were by October operating with a survivability profile that shocked the operational analysts. Crew casualties per tank engagement dropped 40% between June and October 1944 in units that had fully integrated the combined system. The same period saw German anti-tank team effectiveness measured in kills per team per engagement fall by more than half. But the man standing at the center of the Aracourt analysis, Captain Combs, who had fought for 3 weeks to keep the stabilizer program alive against institutional inertia and component failure statistics, received no medal for what happened in that fog. His operational research report was absorbed into a larger Army Ground Forces assessment that credited the victory to combined arms doctrine broadly defined. The specific mechanisms, the telephone, the traverse timing the stabilizer, the open hatch were listed as contributing factors in a document that most people in the Army never read. That is the nature of the kind of contribution that wins wars. It is usually invisible in the official record. The men who fire the guns get the citations. The men who made the guns worth firing get a footnote. But here is what the footnote does not tell you. After the war, the armies that studied Aracourt most carefully were not American, and what they built from those lessons would define the geometry of armored warfare for the next 50 years. In Part 4, we will close the story with what happened to the integrated system after the war ended. How the lessons of the Bocage telephone and the Aracourt fog shaped every tank doctrine written after 1945. and what the Sherman's real legacy turns out to be when you strip away the mythology of the tiger and look at what the numbers actually say about which side was learning and which side was dying. The final chapter of this story is the one nobody teaches in military history class, and it is the most important one of all. From a nameless soldier in a Pacific jungle who welded a field telephone to an ammunition can to Captain Combs, fighting a colonel in a rear headquarters to keep a gyroscope program alive, to General Irzik's crews turning panthers into burning hulks in a French fog. 4 mechanisms. 1. Integrated system. A kill ratio of 3.6 to 1 against the tank that every military analyst on Earth had rated as categorically superior. The Sherman was not a better tank. The system built around it was a better weapon. But the cliffhanger at the end of Part 3 asked a question that the kill ratios cannot answer. What happened to the men who built that system when the shooting stopped? What does history do with the people who win wars through ideas rather than firepower? The answer, as it turns out, contains one final twist that almost nobody who studies this campaign ever discusses. Captain William Combs returned to the United States in the spring of 1945 and was separated from active service by December of that year. He received a Bronze Star for his operational research work with the 2nd Armored Division, a decoration that sits in the middle tier of American military recognition, above a Commendation Medal and well below a Silver Star. The citation described his contribution in the language of bureaucratic understatement. It noted that his analytical work had contributed to improved armored tactics. It did not name the stabilizer program. It did not reference the 3 weeks he spent fighting institutional resistance to keep a life-saving technology in the hands of the men who needed it. It did not mention the colonel who tried to reassign him to a logistics depot for asking uncomfortable questions about why American tankers were dying. Combs went home to Ohio. He took a job as an engineer at a manufacturing firm. He did not write a memoir. He did not seek interviews. In the years when popular histories of the Normandy campaign were being written and the mythology of the Sherman as an inferior death trap was hardening into received wisdom, Combs was working in an office building in Cleveland, and nobody was calling him to ask what he knew. WWII. Brigadier General Albin Irzik, the man who gave Combs the platform to prove the stabilizer's value and who drove his tank commanders to adopt the open-hatch doctrine, despite the sniper risk, survived the war and went on to a distinguished post-war career. He eventually wrote a memoir and gave interviews to military historians. He lived to see the rehabilitation of the Sherman's reputation in academic literature. He died in 2020 at the age of 101, and he was sharp enough in his final years to describe the Air Accord engagement in precise tactical detail. He remembered the fog. He remembered the telephone calls from the infantry forward scouts. He remembered the sound of panther tracks in the mist, and the 15-second hydraulic whine of the traverse motor moving the gun onto a bearing called in by a soldier crouching behind the hull with a handset lifted from an ammunition can. The unnamed Pacific soldier who first rigged that handset to the Sherman's intercom in the jungle of Bougainville in 1943 received nothing. His name is not in any official record that has been declassified. The modification he created, or that his unit collectively created, is categorized in military archives as a field expedient communication adapter. It has no inventor. It has no patent. It has no citation attached to a name. The most tactically significant individual innovation of the American armored campaign in the Second World War is listed in the historical record as anonymous. But here is what that anonymity actually tells you about how the American military machine functioned at its best. The telephone modification spread because it worked, not because someone with rank endorsed it. It jumped from the Pacific to Europe through informal channels, through soldiers writing letters home, and veterans rotating between theaters and mechanics in motor pools comparing notes. No general ordered its adoption. No official program funded its manufacture. It propagated like a solution to a problem that everyone recognized because it was exactly that. The army that could absorb that kind of bottom-up innovation and transmit it laterally across theaters and oceans was an army with a learning architecture that its opponents could not match.
but it too short.
The Westinghouse gyroscopic stabilizer did not disappear when the Sherman was retired from American service. The fundamental principle it demonstrated that a moving armored vehicle with active gun stabilization is both more survivable and more accurate than a stopped one became the architectural foundation of every main battle tank designed by any major power after 1950. The Soviet T-54, introduced in 1949, incorporated a two-axis gun stabilizer directly informed by the captured Sherman analysis that Soviet engineers had conducted on vehicles taken from German forces. The British Centurion received a fully stabilized gun system in its Mark III variant in 1948. The American M48 Patton carried a stabilizer as standard equipment from its first production run. The irony is precise and somewhat painful. The stabilizer that a colonel tried to take out of American tanks in 1944 because he believed stationary fire was doctrinally superior became the single most universally adopted feature in post-war tank design across every major military power on Earth. Every Abrams tank, every Leopard 2, every Challenger 2, every T-90 operating anywhere in the world today carries a direct descendant of the mechanism that Westinghouse delivered to the Sherman program in 1941. And that American Army doctrine nearly trained its crews to ignore. The infantry telephone system evolved differently. The improvised ammunition can handset was replaced by purpose-built infantry telephone kits standardized across the American armored force by 1945. These were carried through the Korean War, where American tank crews fighting in terrain that bore a disturbing similarity to the Norman Bocage discovered that the lessons of 1944 were entirely transferable to 1950. The Marines at the Chosin Reservoir used infantry telephone protocols, adapted directly from the European theater experience, to coordinate tank infantry teams in conditions of extreme cold and limited visibility that would have been familiar to any veteran of the Aracourt fog. The open hatch doctrine persisted through Vietnam in modified form. American tank commanders in the Mekong Delta and the Central Highlands who rode exposed to direct their vehicles through jungle terrain were operating on the same tactical calculus that Sherman commanders had worked out in the Bocage. The closed hatch is safer from small arms and lethal in ambush. The open hatch is dangerous from small arms and survivable in ambush. The arithmetic favors the open hatch in close terrain, and every generation of American armor in close terrain has arrived at the same conclusion independently, and then found out that the generation before them arrived there first. The deepest lesson of the Sherman system is not about the telephone or the traverse speed or the stabilizer. Those are mechanisms. The lesson is about the institutional architecture that allowed those mechanisms to be identified, developed, and deployed in the middle of a war by people who had no authorization to change anything. The German military in 1944 was not short of talented engineers. It was not short of innovative thinkers. The men who designed the Tiger and the Panther were genuinely brilliant, and the vehicles they produced were in several specific respects technically superior to anything the Americans had. What the German military lacked was a mechanism for absorbing lessons from the bottom of the hierarchy and acting on them before the situation that produced those lessons had already killed everyone it was going to kill. The colonel who tried to suppress Combs's stabilizer analysis was not a villain. He was a product of a system that prioritized institutional consistency over empirical feedback. He had spent a career building doctrinal expertise, and he was defending it the way anyone defends expertise when evidence challenges it. The American system did not defeat him through superior enlightenment. It defeated him because Irzik had the standing to arrange a demonstration, and the two visiting officers from Army Group Headquarters had the authority to override the memo without making it a formal dispute. And the system worked not because it was perfectly designed, but because it had enough flexibility at enough levels that a determined captain with good numbers could find a path around a resistant colonel. That flexibility, that tolerance for informal channels, and field-expedient solutions, and bottom-up innovation, is the real weapon that the Pacific telephone soldier built. He built it not out of metal, but out of the assumption that his judgment about what was killing his friends was as valid as any doctrine written by someone who had never been in the hedge. Now for the detail that most histories of this campaign never reach. The specific Sherman that Captain Combs used as his primary data point in the Aracourt kill ratio analysis. The tank whose stabilizer engagement records he cross-referenced against its engagement outcomes to build the statistical case that kept the program alive was destroyed on October 3, 1944. 2 weeks after the battle, it helped win. Its crew survived. The commander, a sergeant from Kentucky, whose name appears in the operational records but not in any published history, was wounded in the arm by shrapnel from a Panzerfaust round that hit the rear deck and fragmented. He was evacuated to a field hospital, treated, and returned to his unit 3 weeks later. When he came back, his replacement tank had a field telephone welded to the rear hull and a functioning Westinghouse stabilizer that his crew had been trained to trust. He rode the rest of the war with his hatch open. He was never told that the tank he had commanded was the centerpiece of a statistical argument that changed American armored doctrine. He was never told that the records of his engagements had been used to prove that a moving Sherman with a functioning stabilizer was more effective than a stationary one. He found out, according to a post-war letter he wrote to his battalion's Veterans Association, only when he read a history of the 2nd Armored Division published in 1979. He was 61 years old. He wrote that he had thought the stabilizer was just a thing his gunner liked because it made the gun feel smooth. He did not know it had been controversial. He did not know anyone had nearly taken it away from him. From an unnamed soldier with a welding torch and an ammunition can to a captain with a clipboard, fighting a colonel in a rear headquarters to a sergeant in a Kentucky accent, who thought his stabilizer was just a thing his gunner liked. The integrated system that broke German ambush doctrine in Normandy and destroyed 2 Panther brigades in a morning fog at Aracourt was built by people who did not know they were building history. They were solving the problem directly in front of them with whatever was in reach, and they were doing it because the alternative was dying in a burning steel box on a Norman farm road, and that was unacceptable. The 4 mechanisms saved an uncountable number of lives. American armored crew casualty rates fell 40% between June and October 1944 in fully integrated units. The Aracourt engagement alone preserved the Third Army's ability to advance into Germany at a moment when a successful German counterattack could have stalled the campaign by months. Historians who have modeled the Lorraine campaign estimate that the collapse of the Panzer Brigade offensive at Aracourt shortened the Western War by between 3 and 6 weeks. At the casualty rates of late 1944, 3 weeks represent somewhere between 15 and 20,000 American lives. 15,000 lives. From a telephone, from a piece of wire, from one soldier in a jungle who decided that the man crouching in the mud behind his tank had something important to say and deserved to be heard immediately. If you have a grandfather or a father who served with the 2nd or 4th Armored, with the 8th or 37th Tank Battalion in the hedgerows of Normandy, or the fog of Lorraine, I would be honored to read his story in the comments. Those accounts live in families, and they matter more than any statistic. Share this video if you believe the people who win wars through ideas deserve to be remembered alongside the people who win them through firepower. Subscribe if you want to be here when we tell the next story that the official history's buried in a footnote. Done? The German High Command spent the entire war building heavier steel. The Americans spent it building a better nervous system. In the end, the nervous system won. And it was built one improvised component at a time by people whose names we mostly never learned. That is the kind of courage that actually changes history. Not the kind that charges a machine gun. The kind that picks up a telephone in the middle of a war and says quietly, clearly, and with absolute conviction, "I know where the enemy is." Are you listening?